Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Jody Dobrowski. He was a young man who in late 2005 became the victim of a brutal hate crime in London. He was attacked and murdered during his walk home one night, and the killer's motive for this horrific crime was homophobia. They targeted Jody because of his sexuality, and Jody's case would mark a huge turning point when it came to sentencing criminals who are motivated by their victim's sexual orientation. It was a landmark case in Britain, which is something that we'll actually go into further later on in the video. Just before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young man and it involves heavy themes such as homophobia, homophobic slurs and violence towards the LGBTQ+ community. Viewer discretion is advised. This video may be triggering for LGBTQ+ people who have been victims of violence or abuse, so I'm going to leave some links in the description box to different LGBT charities and helplines that can offer support if you feel like you need it, including a link to Gallup, which is an LGBTQ+ anti-abuse charity that we have here in the UK, and they do absolutely incredible work to provide help and support to thousands of LGBT people who have or who are experiencing violence and abuse in its various forms, including victims of hate crimes. I will be donating a large portion of the ad revenue from this video to Gallup, so fingers crossed YouTube actually monetize this one. If you would like to make a donation to help fund the work that Gallup do, then their donation page will also be linked down below. But if you aren't in a position to donate anything right now, then you can still make a huge difference by just watching the ads on this video if any pop up, because the more people watch the ads, the more revenue we can contribute. So we can all work on this together and try to raise a bit of money. But yeah, having said all of that, let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back to October of 2005 in the area of Clapham, which is located in southwest London in England, and this is Jody Dobrowski. He was 24 years old at the time that this case took place. He was born on the 27th of June 1981. He was of Polish descent, however he was actually born in the town of Stroud in Gloucestershire in the southwest of England. Jody's mother is called Jody Dobrowski, and I couldn't find the name of his father anywhere. I'm not entirely sure if he really had much to do with his biological father, but Jody did have a stepfather. His mum's partner Mike became Jody's stepfather, and Jody also had a brother too, and his name was Jake. Unfortunately, there isn't really much information online about Jody's early life, so like his childhood, so I can't comment on what that was like. But in his teenage years, he went to a high school in Stroud called Archway School, and then sources state that following this, after he left high school, he became a uni student. He went to the University of Wales in Cardiff, where he started studying biomedical sciences. Although he wasn't really there for too long, he eventually chose to drop out of uni, and in 2001, at around 20 years old, he made the decision to move to London. Jody moved to Clapham in London into a flat in an area called Lavender Gardens, which he shared with two flatmates, and following his move to London, he started working in different bars, and eventually he got a job working as a barman at a club called Bar Reza Jongleurs in Camden, which by all accounts he really enjoyed. He loved his job and he was very good at it. He got along well with the other staff and with the customers. He was so good at this job, in fact, that he was ultimately offered a promotion. He was promoted to assistant manager. Now, pretty much every source and every article about this case does state that Jody Jody was homosexual. He was a gay man. Although from what I can gather from one source, he never kind of officially came out. As I understand it from different articles, he was out to his friends, but he hadn't officially come out to his family yet, but his family knew. He hadn't sat them down and made this huge announcement, but they knew. They weren't oblivious to his sexuality. Jody found the idea of coming out quite difficult because he was still trying to work things out, trying to figure out exactly who he was. On one source, I came across a quote from Jody's family which reads, "Jody knew he was loved and accepted. He knew that we knew. He was also a young man still discovering his identity and facing the difficulty of having to come out, which straight people never have to face. The timing of this was up to him. He had very little time. He did not know that." Jody was described by those that knew him as being literally like a gentle giant. He was very kind, very caring, very lovable, hardworking, funny. He had a great sense of humour. He always had a lot of friends. His stepfather Mike said that Jody was one of those people that just got on with everyone, and he had been like that ever since he was a child. He found it very easy to connect with people, and he was very sociable and friendly. In fact, he's been described as being the kind of person that anyone would want as a friend. He really seemed like just such a lovely, genuine person with a beautiful personality. I have another quote here from one of Jody's colleagues who he worked with at the bar in Camden, and he said about Jody, "If you had met this gentleman, you would know him to be a fresh-faced young man who never said a nasty word to anyone, even to the drunks who came in off the street. That was his way, a kind, sweet guy." And he was so young. He was just a 24-year-old man who had moved to the city of London. He was building a good career for himself. He was having fun. He had his whole life and his whole future ahead of him. That was until late 2005, when Jody's life was suddenly ended in the most horrific way as he became the victim of a vicious hate crime. The date was the 14th of October 2005, and that evening, it was a Friday evening, Jody Dobrowski had been out with friends in Clapham. He'd been seeing some friends from work, and then at around 10:15 p.m. he said goodbye to his friends and he started to walk back home. He was walking home alone, and he decided to walk through Clapham Common, which is a big open public space, a big park in London. It's actually one of London's oldest and largest parks, so it's kind of what Clapham is most known for. It's more than 85 hectares in size, and I believe this was kind of a shortcut for Jody on his way home. If he walked through Clapham Common rather than along the main road, it would have taken him only about 10 minutes to get back to his flat. However, Jody Dobrowski never made it back to his flat. He never returned home because that night he was brutally attacked and left for dead. Whilst he was walking along the common, Jody was approached by two men who seemed to automatically just assume that Jody was gay, because apparently back then, I'm not quite sure if it's the same now, but back when this case took place in 2005, Clapham Common was known for being a place for gay men to meet at night. They would go to the park and they would start chatting to other gay men, often trying to find someone to hook up with. And so these two men who approached Jody that night just assumed instantly that he was gay. Just because he was walking along the common at night, they assumed he was homosexual. And this angered them. So as soon as they saw Jody, they decided to ambush him. They started shouting at Jody, calling him disgusting names. They were shouting various homophobic slurs at him and just being generally vile. And this verbal abuse they subjected him to very quickly turned physical. They quickly became violent towards Jody. One of the men walked up to him and they began punching him in the face. And it wasn't long before the second man joined in with the assault. He too started punching Jody. They were hitting him repeatedly with their fists. They knocked him to the ground, and it was then when they started literally kicking him repeatedly. They were stamping on him. They were completely and utterly ruthless. These vile men just kept going and going. They were just beating and torturing Jody, trying to cause him as much pain as they possibly could. To think about what Jody must have gone through during the attack is just horrible. The fear that he must have experienced and the pain he must have been in is just unimaginable. Now, despite the fact that this happened pretty late at night, there were witnesses to the attack. Some sources say that there were a few people who saw it happen, or they heard the commotion, they heard the shouting. But there was one man in particular who witnessed the attack. He was out jogging along the common that night when he came across these men verbally and physically assaulting Jody, and he tried to stop them, he tried to intervene. However, these men just started to threaten him, and apparently the attackers said to him, there is a homophobic slur in this quote, by the way, they said to him, "We don't like pufters here, and that's why we can kill him if we want." It was clear to this man that these men were not going to stop. He could try to pull them away from Jody, but if he did that, it was more than likely that they would start just beating him too. And so this man grabbed his phone and he called the police. He called 999. By the time the emergency services arrived at the scene, the attackers had fled, and so paramedics immediately started trying to help Jody. He was unconscious by this point, but he was alive, although he was literally clinging on to life. So he was rushed to the hospital where doctors tried desperately hard to save him, but tragically they were unable to do so. His injuries were just way too severe, and so not long after he arrived at the hospital, he was pronounced dead. Jody Dobrowski had been beaten to death, and later in his autopsy the pathologist wasn't even able to determine how many times he had been hit and kicked. That's how vicious this attack was. It was determined that he had at least 33 separate areas of injury to his head, face, ears and neck. Jody's nose was broken during the attack, his brain was swollen, he had bruises on his neck, his spine and his groin. Ultimately, his cause of death was determined to have been, quote, a result of the combination of a brain injury, extensive bleeding, the inhalation of blood, and a severe crushing injury to the larynx. The injuries that he had sustained were just barbaric, and actually that meant that it took a little while for the police to actually identify him. Obviously, Jody was walking home alone that night, so when police and paramedics were called to the scene, they didn't know who he was. For the time being, he was a John Doe. The first thing they had to do was find out the victim's name, but this was going to be difficult because of his injuries. He was beaten around the head so badly that he was unrecognizable. He was so bruised and swollen. In fact, officers who were first at the scene that evening described him as looking like a, quote, bloody swollen pulp. After Jody was rushed to the hospital that evening, before he sadly died, the police immediately began their inquiries on the common. The crime scene was cordoned off, they began looking around for any potential evidence, and as you might expect, because this was a public place, a public park, this attracted the attention of several members of the public. They noticed the police activity and they were standing watching nearby, eager to find out what had gone on. And amongst these onlookers were actually some of Jody's friends, the friends who he'd been out with earlier that night, and I think they instantly panicked. They realised that something bad had happened on the common. They knew that Jody would have walked along the common during his journey home that night, and so they were worried that maybe he had been involved in whatever had happened here. So his friends spoke to police officers at the scene. They shared their concerns that something might have happened to their friend Jody, and so the detectives started looking into the possibility that perhaps their unidentified victim was Jody Dobrowski. As I said, because of the victim's injuries, they wouldn't be able to confirm the identification just from looking at him because he was so unrecognizable. But the police were able to obtain Jody's fingerprints from a glass that he had been drinking out of earlier that night, I believe, and these prints were compared to that of the victim, and of course they were a match. Jody was the one who had been attacked and killed on the common that night. The police got in touch with Jody's family back in Gloucestershire and they were informed about what had happened. They were told the devastating news. And following his passing, obviously a murder investigation was launched. The hunt was on to catch these evil men that committed this crime, this hate crime. However, again, like the identifying the victim process, it seemed as though this was also going to be difficult for the police because they really didn't have much to go on. They only really had one key witness in the case, the man who was jogging on the common that night, the one who tried to intervene and stop the men from hurting Jody. As I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of other people on the common who heard the attack and I think maybe saw glimpses of it, but this man was really the only one who had basically seen the whole thing. But in all honesty, even he didn't really see much. I mean, he saw the two men beating and shouting at Jody, but unfortunately he didn't really get a good look at their faces because it was very late at night, so it was dark outside, and I don't think this part of the common where the attack happened was very well lit. So the witness wasn't really able to describe the killers in great detail. All he knew was that it was two men, two white men. He said that one was taller than the other, they both had short hair, they both had British accents, but that was it. That was all he could tell the police, so detectives didn't really have much to work with here. But one of the first things detectives did was look more into Jody's life, into his background, trying to determine whether this attack was personal. Was he targeted by people that knew him and wanted him dead for some reason? Did he have any enemies? But it soon became clear that he didn't. I mean, as I said around the start of the video, Jody was described as being such a nice person, the kind of person that got along with everyone. No one in his life would have had a motive for wanting to do this to him, so it seemed as though the men that attacked him that night were complete strangers and their motive was simply homophobia. Like I mentioned, this was a hate crime, clearly. The witness said that these men, as they were beating Jody, they were shouting horrible homophobic slurs at him. Jody was murdered because of prejudice, because of his sexuality, or what the killers presumed his sexuality was. They believed that he deserved to die for that. So of course, when the news broke, when news spread about Jody's murder, other people in the LGBTQ plus community in London were scared. If these two men can brutally murder a young man in a public park just because they assumed he was gay, then these are the kinds of killers that are very likely to strike again. So the pressure was on the detectives to find these murderers, and fast, before they could do any more harm. The police also appealed to the public following Jody's murder. They urged anyone with any information about the killers to come forward, and they also asked anyone who was on the common that night to come forward, just in case they could have seen anything that might help them identify the perpetrators. Another line of inquiry the police had to follow up on was CCTV. Unfortunately, there were no CCTV cameras directly on Clapham Common, so instead they were trying to get a hold of CCTV from like any local shops or from any houses nearby that had CCTV cameras outside. They were asking for CCTV from buses that drove past the common during their route, etc. Because if they went through this footage, perhaps the police might be able to spot either Jody walking towards the common or who his killers might be. Who knows, maybe they would even see the killers following him to the common that evening. And as well as that line of inquiry, the lead detective of the case, Detective Nick Scholar, also decided to start looking into the local hostels. I think in particular any local bail hostels in and around Clapham, because I mean it was probably likely that the killers had offended before. Murder is unlikely to be their first ever crime, so perhaps they were people that were living in a bail hostel at the time. Maybe they had recently been released from prison and they didn't yet have a permanent address. That was their accommodation. And as it turns out, this line of inquiry would prove to be the breakthrough that the police needed in the case. Because when they went to this one hostel and they spoke to the people that lived there, there was one resident in particular that had some very interesting information to share with the police. This resident said that on the night in question, on the night that Jody Dobrowski was attacked and killed, two other residents, two men, returned to the hostel late that evening and they were covered in blood. They had blood all over them. And the two men said to this other resident that they had just given someone a, quote, good kicking. They'd just beaten someone up on the common. According to one article, one of the men's exact quotes was, "I've just kicked the crap out of someone. I feel great." So of course the police are immediately thinking, these have to be the guys. These residents must have been the men that murdered Jody. They literally said they'd beaten someone up on the common on the same night that Jody was attacked. These must have been his killers. The police would soon discover that these men were Scott Walker, who was aged around his early 30s, and Thomas Pickford, who was aged around his mid-20s. They'd both, I think, recently been released from prison, hence why they were living at the bail hostel, and that was actually where the two of them met. They met each other at the hostel. So they both had criminal records. Thomas Pickford had several previous convictions for crimes such as theft and burglary, whereas Scott Walker had previous convictions of criminal damage, making threats to kill, and he'd recently been convicted of assault. And the person he assaulted was his own mother. In late 2004, he attacked his mum by pushing her up against the door. He then proceeded to punch her in the face and bite her on the nose before kicking her repeatedly while she was on the floor and attempting to strangle her. He put his hands around her neck. Thankfully, his mother did survive this horrific attack and Scott Walker was arrested. And in January of 2005, he was sentenced to spend 15 months in prison. However, he clearly didn't serve his full sentence because he was out by October of 2005 when Jody was killed. So for some reason, this incredibly violent man was released early. Obviously, when he was released, he started staying at the bail hostel, and it turns out actually that he was on license right up until the day before Jody's murder. Now, after the police had identified Scott Walker and Thomas Pickford as being Jody's suspected killers, they actually arrested Scott Walker straight away because he was still staying at the hostel at the time. So he was arrested on suspicion of murder and taken into custody. And the police and forensic teams started going through his room at the hostel to see if they could find any potential evidence that linked him to the crime. And they collected a load of his belongings and clothing, which they sent to the crime lab for testing to see if they could perhaps find any trace of Jody's blood on them. In the meantime, whilst that was happening and while Scott Walker was being questioned, the police were obviously also trying to find Thomas Pickford because he wasn't actually still at the hostel at the time. He'd recently been kicked out because it was found that he was using heroin whilst he was there. So he was told to leave, and of course that meant that trying to find him was going to be tricky because he had no permanent address. He could have been anywhere, but thankfully they were eventually able to trace him to Croydon. I think he was staying with a friend or an acquaintance there, so he too was arrested. Now, I believe initially in their interviews, both men denied it. They denied having anything to do with Jody's murder. However, it wasn't long before the police obtained evidence which ultimately proved that that was a lie, which proved that they were responsible. Firstly, they found forensic evidence. They were able to find traces of blood on a pair of Scott Walker's shoes, which when tested was found to be a match to the victim, to Jody. It was Jody's blood on Walker's shoes. These were the shoes that he was wearing that night, the shoes that Walker had on whilst he kicked and stamped on Jody. And the police also obtained CCTV footage of the two men, which proved that they were out together that night and that they were around the area where the crime took place. The men had been out drinking that night in Clapham. The police found CCTV footage of them both in a bar. After they left the bar, the police were able to trace their steps as they began the walk back to the hostel. They found more CCTV footage of them along their route. And as well as this, the police had a witness come forward, a woman who said that she had been harassed by two men that night as she got off the bus near the common. And these two men that harassed her matched the description of Walker and Pickford. This woman said that as she got off the bus, the men tried to literally grab her. They tried to grab her arm. They started following her and harassing her. They were making disgusting sexual comments comments towards her, but luckily she was able to get away from them and they continued walking. And it's believed that from here they walked to the common, where Jody Dobrowski unfortunately crossed their paths as he was walking home after being out with friends. Now, as I said initially, when the men were first interviewed, they denied it and they basically said no comment to the questions put forward to them. And I think Scott Walker maintained that for a while. He decided to stay silent for a while. However, Thomas Pickford sooner or later confessed to the crime. That's what I can gather anyway from different online sources and articles. And eventually, after collecting different pieces of evidence and from different statements, the police were able to piece together what they believed happened on the night that Jody Dobrowski was killed, what the men did. It soon became clear to the police that this crime was premeditated. Walker and Pickford went to Clapham Common that night with the intention of brutally attacking someone, brutally attacking a gay person, because the Common wasn't actually along their route home that evening. They started walking towards the hostel, but they took a diversion to the Common, which was the long way home. If they'd walked along the streets along the main road, it would have been a quicker route. But they didn't. They wanted to go along the Common to find a victim. And the police found out that Jody wasn't actually the first person that Pickford and Walker had targeted. It turns out that just 2 weeks before Jody's murder, they'd attacked another gay man on the Common. They approached him, they started beating him up, forced him to the ground, and they beat him until he was unconscious. And then they left. And thankfully, this man survived. And then just a fortnight later, Walker and Pickford decided that they wanted to do it again. So late in the evening on the 14th of October 2005, after a night of drinking, they walked to the Common and they approached Jody Dobrowski. As we know, as we discussed earlier, they started verbally abusing him. They were shouting homophobic slurs at him. And then it was Thomas Pickford who started the physical attack. He was the one who threw the first punches at Jody. And he actually told the police in his interview when he eventually confessed that he did it. He started punching Jody just to impress Scott Walker. His exact quote was, "I just wanted to look like a hard man." Quickly, Scott Walker joined in with the assault. He too started punching and beating Jody. They beat him to the ground. They started kicking and stamping on him. It seems as though Walker quickly took the lead with the assault. Pickford was the one who started it, but Walker took over. He started beating and kicking Jody more than Pickford. And another thing that Pickford told the police was that he was too scared of Scott Walker to try and stop him. I read on one source that during the attack, Scott Walker actually removed one of Jody's shoes and his sock and he stuffed it inside of his mouth. And then when both men were satisfied with what they had done, they just walked away. And they left Jody to die on the ground. As we know, afterwards they returned to the Bale hostel absolutely covered in blood, and they immediately told that other resident what they'd just done. They said that they had just attacked a gay man on the Common. They were literally bragging about it. They were proud of what they had done. The year following the crime, in May of 2006, both men pleaded guilty to the charge of murder, and it's believed that the only reason they did this was to hopefully get a more lenient sentence. They clearly knew that there was no way a jury would find them not guilty because the evidence against them was just overwhelming. So they thought that they might as well admit it, might as well plead guilty and hope that the judge will take that into consideration and give them a lighter sentence. However, thankfully, it did not work in their favour because it turns out that this would actually be a landmark case in Britain, because I believe it was the first time where Section 146 of the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 was utilised when it came to deciding the sentence. A couple of years before this case took place, Section 146 was established, which allows courts to impose tougher sentences for offences which are motivated by the victim's sexual orientation. Like this case, these evil men killed Jody because of homophobia. So section 146 meant that the judge could use that as an aggravating feature when deciding on the sentence. And at the end of their court proceedings, both Scott Walker and Thomas Pickford were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 28 years. Now, the minimum sentence an adult can get for murder in the UK is usually life in prison with a minimum of 15 years. But the use of section 146 in this case meant that Walker and Pickford's sentences were going to be a lot higher. At the very least, they were going to be behind bars for 28 years before they were even considered for release. So I believe they will come up for parole around 2034. After her son's killers were sentenced, Jody's mother Sherry read out a statement outside of the Old Bailey Court in London. She said, "In a free and democratic society, Jody's murder was an outrage. It was a political act. It was an act of terrorism. Jody was not the first man to be killed or terrorized or beaten or humiliated for being homosexual or for being perceived to be homosexual. Tragically, he will not be the last man to suffer the consequences of homophobia, which is endemic in this society. This is unacceptable. We cannot accept this. No intelligent, healthy or reasonable society could." She also paid tribute to her son in her statement. She said, "On behalf of her and the rest of the family, we would like to pay tribute to Jody Dobrowski for his strength in the face of cowardice, for struggling to become who he was, an intelligent, funny, hardworking and beautiful man whose life was brutally and mercilessly punched and kicked from him, who fought for some hours to stay with us and whose big dancing feet left behind such gentle footprints on this earth." On the 7-year anniversary of Jody's death in 2012, a memorial bench for Jody was installed on Clapham Common following a fundraising campaign which was held to try and raise money to pay for the bench. Apparently about £2,700 was raised, so the community used about 1,000 of that to pay for the bench, and then the rest was donated to a hate crime charity. And in 2018, a tree was also planted by Jody's bench as part of a memorial project on Clapham Common. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Jody Dobrowski. I don't even know how to sum up my thoughts on this case. It's been one of the hardest for me to research and cover because it's just absolutely devastating. Hate crime cases always just get to me so much. I feel like I managed to hold it in and keep it together for most of the video, and now I've just crumbled. Again, I want to mention that there will be some links in the description to various LGBTQ+ charities and helplines that can offer help and support for victims of abuse and violence. One of which, as I said, will be to Gallop, which is a UK-based LGBT anti-abuse charity. If there are any LGBT people watching this in the UK who are experiencing abuse and you feel like you need to talk about it, then Gallop do have a free helpline which you can contact in order to get some support and advice. You can either call them and speak to someone over the phone, or you can email, or they have a web chat option too. And if you would like to help fund the work that they do, you can also donate to the charity. The link to donate will be down below. But yeah, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. Also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. Please do give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye.